Hello and welcome to a special interview for The Wire. As we enter Unlock 1, what is the state of the economy and what are the steps the government needs to take to ensure that it revives? Those are the key questions I should raise today with India's former Chief Statistician and one of the country's most highly regarded economists, Pronab Sen. Dr. Sen, let me start with a simple question. As we enter Unlock 1, what, in your eyes, is the state of the economy? What's your assessment of the economy today?
The assessment is not good, Karan. Not good at all. We've been through an extended period of lockdown, and if my assessment is correct, we have been losing roughly 2 lakh crores of rupees per week. So in the 9 odd weeks that we've been under lockdown, we've lost about 18 crores, plus add a few more from the 2 weeks preceding, which the states had locked down, the center hadn't. And we're talking about somewhere near 20 lakh crore loss of incomes. Now, as we know that the distribution of this income between different income earners is very, very different. The bulk of this burden has been borne by the poorer segments. Most of us who are on salaries have had our salaries protected. But the other part of the loss is companies are bearing a loss, and a large loss at that. And the third part of the loss is the loss that the governments are taking, both state and center, on their tax receipts. Now, the effects of all these losses are going to play through the next few years.
Now, the State Bank of India has calculated that they believe in the first quarter of this year, the economy could actually shrink by something like over 40%, and over the year as a whole, perhaps by 6.8%. And roughly speaking, CRISIL and Fitch seem to agree. What's your feeling? What will be the impact in terms of negative growth over this whole year?
Well, these depend on assumptions. The assumption that I go by is that the government has pretty much done all the fiscal stimulus it intends to. And if I go by that, what I am looking at is first quarter negative growth of 32%. And for the year, and this is where my projections are very different from the SBI's projections, for the year we are looking at minus 12.5%.
Minus 12.5% is almost double the SBI projection.
That is correct.
Which means it is a terrible year for the country, perhaps one of the worst we've ever had.
It will be the worst we've ever had.
Now, in terms of what this means for people and jobs, for human beings, you've said that if the government does nothing more than what it's announced, you believe the unemployment rate for the year as a whole will be between 8 and 8.5%. Does that translate into tens of millions of people losing their jobs?
No. I think you're quoting a newspaper on this. What I said to them was that it would be about 2.5% over the current, which is 8.5%. So we are really looking at something like an unemployment rate of 11% by the end of the year.
And what does an unemployment rate of 11% mean in terms of the numbers who lose jobs? Are we talking of tens of millions?
We're talking about 50 million people unemployed.
50 million unemployed. That is a huge number of people. I mean, I'm repeating this because I think for the audience it will be quite staggering. You're estimating that if the government doesn't do anything more than it's done, we will shrink by 12.5% as an economy. The unemployment rate will go up to possibly 11%, and that amounts to 50 million Indians losing their jobs.
Am I right? People without jobs.
People without jobs. So clearly, the lockdown has not only failed to flatten the curve because we are growing at something like 9.5, 9.6 thousand a day, But clearly, the lockdown has also brought the Indian economy to its knees.
Well, the Indian economy is in bad shape. There is no question about it. As far as the disease incidence is concerned, this is really a job for experts, and they are not sounding very optimistic.
Let me then at this stage come to the critical question, what should the government do? And I'm repeating what you said, that the Indian economy is in very bad shape, there's no question about it. My phrase is that the lockdown has brought the economy to its knees. So, is the first important requirement of the government that they must do everything possible in every way to boost demand?
This is correct. They should. And the bad news is that most of the features surrounding the economy are not going to help us. So, if you think about what I'm saying, the reason I'm getting this higher negative growth rate than others is because I do expect a large shock coming in from the export side. The world economy is in doldrums and will continue to be so. So you're going to get another shock happening from that channel as well, which will last through the year. Now, in order to combat this, there is only one entity left, and that is the government. And to actually drill it down further, Karan, the state governments are broke. The center has permitted the states to raise another 2% of GDP in terms of borrowings. That comes to about 4.2 lakh crores. But my estimate is that the states would be losing about 4.5 lakh crores. So the states will continue to be in a hole even with further borrowings. So anything that has to be done in terms of reviving the economy, I think rests squarely on the shoulders of the central government.
And so far, the central government is showing no indication of doing anything more than what it announced towards the third week of May. And
Uh,
that's the basis on which your assumptions are also worked out.
yes, it's in fact a little worse than that, Karan, because after having announced the package, one is hearing uh, the government making various announcements about cutting down on their other expenditures. Now, that's not a good sign because all of this is assuming that the government continues to spend what it had budgeted for. Now, if you actually cut that down, then the effective stimulus you're giving is going to be lower than the 2 lakh crores that you have given. Because you're giving with one hand and taking away with another.
So, in fact, what you're hearing from the government is the exact opposite of what you want to hear. You want the government to do more, you want a bigger fiscal stimulus. Instead, the government is talking of further cutting down expenditure, which will reduce the impact of what little they've done. So, the situation will progressively get worse, not better.
Well, that depends on how you measure it. Now, economics is a strange subject. Things don't necessarily work linearly. Things don't necessarily go in the same direction. So if you want to think about how the economy is going to progress, it will actually not look that bad. So we are starting with minus 32% growth. Next quarter, you may actually see minus 8. The quarter after that, minus 5, and you think you're through. Then the first quarter of next calendar year, which is the fourth quarter of this fiscal, you'll actually see positive growth. And then the first quarter of the next fiscal, which is the quarter we are in this fiscal, will be a very strong positive growth. And then after that, we'll go back into negative territory.
So, in other words, the government will believe that it's done the right thing and the economy is responding because of this, and I'll use the word illusion of growth improving until we hit what you call the first quarter or the second quarter of the next year, when growth will once again precipitously fall.
That's right.
And the only way to avert this is for the government to take steps to stimulate the economy way more than it's done, so that demand grows and demand provides the impetus thereafter.
That's right. And in fact, it's not just provide more stimulus, the timing is important. It should be done now. The reason for that, Karan, is that over this period of low growth, what you're going to be seeing is capacities, production capacities winding up because firms are going broke. Now, if there is sufficient damage to the production capacities, then even when we are ready to come back into a positive growth path, there may not be the physical capacity to produce more output. So we've got to forestall the possibility of emergence of large bankruptcies. Now, what we've done in effect, and it's not a bad step, mind you, is we've papered that over. We've told the banks and the other creditors that they are not to recognize bad loans for the next 6 months. So the damage that is being caused is not being seen at the moment. But that doesn't mean that the damage is not happening.
In other words, we've postponed the damage with the moratoriums, and as a result, we've hidden it from our present day vision. But when the moratorium ends, the damage will happen and it will be there for all to see. That's when bankruptcies will begin happening.
It would have happened cumulatively.
Which means it will hit us with a big bang rather than happen steadily.
That's right.
Let me then pull back at this point, because we know that the answer is an immediate stimulus, and as you said, now, not tomorrow or day after, but now. Time is of the essence. We don't have time on our side. And yet, the government shows no signs of acting now, and you're even worried it may not act tomorrow and day after either. So let's, in the hope that someone in the government is listening, try and give them advice through your answers about what sort of demand stimulus is needed. And let's start with that category who you said were the worst affected, the bulk of India's poor. Let's start with the migrant workers and others who've lost their jobs and are destitute. Now, a variety of newspaper reports have suggested that during the months of April and May, perhaps as many as 200 million did not get the extra 5 kilograms of grain that was given. Newspapers like the Times of India have suggested that perhaps only 46-47% of people were able to access the 500 rupees in Jan Dhan accounts. So in the first instance, if building demand is essential, should we start by putting money in these people's pockets immediately?
Well, that is how the stimulus package that we have at present is essentially that. And I think that's the right way to do it. Now, there are clearly problems with the delivery system. So all the reports you're talking about, the intent is to give the 5 kilos of grain. The intent is to put 500 rupees. All of this, the grain part of it, I think is all right. The 500 rupees is way too small. It should be at least 4 times that, if not 5 times that. So fixing the delivery system is not all that easy, and I don't necessarily hold the government culpable of that. But the basic approach is that you've got to get money out. Whether or not you're giving too much money to a person is unimportant. That money and the income should be out in the system so that they start purchases, which keeps business going. That is really the critical issue, because once businesses can start producing and growing, new income streams will come online.
But the problem, as you pointed out in your answer, is if the government can't either identify the people and then get the system to get the money to them. The problem is both identification and targeting. How does it overcome it? Because if I recall correctly, Nirmala Sitharaman has even admitted this to the Hindustan Times. She said Did anyone before this crisis have data on migrant workers? And then she added, how do I identify the poor? So, as you say, the intent is there, but she can't identify them. How does she overcome that problem?
There are two separate issues, Karan. Let's be very clear on this. One is the humanitarian crisis that we're facing. And as far as the humanitarian crisis is concerned, identification and pinpointed delivery is critical. And as I said, the government simply does not have the instrumentalities to be able to do so. It has some, it has tried to use it, it could do better, but nevertheless, that's the focus. But the second part of it is the overall economy. The direct transfers to the poor who have lost their jobs, who have been unable to eat, making sure they have what they need to survive is a humanitarian need, should be filled. But in terms of the economy, the impact isn't that large because the bulk of what they will spend on will be food, and that has fairly small multiplier effects. So the government will have to move on to actually putting out public demand for goods and services. Public investment is a way of doing that. The whole problem is that there again, the government's ability to move fast on ramping up expenditures is not very good. Having been in government for many, many years in the Planning Commission, we know that even if you take a decision today, the first rupee will hit the ground 5 to 6 months later. But that decision has to be taken today.
And you're worried that even those critical decisions about public investment are not being taken today. Did you say I'm right? We lost your voice at that point.
Yes, I said that's right.
Which means whenever the government takes that decision, and we don't know when it will, it may be today, it may be tomorrow, it may be next month, but there is a 6-month time lag before it hits the ground.
That's right.
So there's a whole 6-month gap between the government deciding and it actually making an impact. And the longer the government delays deciding, the further that 6 months becomes.
So we've got a situation where the government has already instructed the ministries that no new projects shall be taken up, which means precisely the sort of things where you possibly could spend money faster because presumably some of the homework had already been done, have been put on hold as things stand today.
This is why you're so concerned about the fact that the government, instead of fulfilling the expenditure to which it is committed, is actually curtailing it and reducing it, as a result of which projects that were sanctioned are not being implemented, and therefore the investment that's necessary won't happen, and that 6-month period will keep getting prolonged because we're simply pushing it further and further down the road.
That's right. In fact, the most sensible thing for the government to do immediately is to instruct ministries that whatever is provided in the budget for whatever head of expenditures must be spent as expeditiously as possible. Yeah, as soon as possible. That should be the first instruction. What we've seen is, in fact, the polar opposite, which is they've been told that no new projects are to be launched, although these are projects which were in the pipeline. So we are actually going backwards.
In other words, the government is doing the exact opposite of what it should be doing.
In my opinion, yes.
That also means that instead of making the situation better, it's making the situation worse.
Yes. So if this continues next year, which is 21-22, I also expect a negative growth rate of about 6% over a negative growth rate this year.
Let me, and this may be contentious, let me, in a sense, paraphrase Mr. Modi. He promised Achhe Din, but by failing to act And by actually, as you say, doing the polar opposite of what he should be doing, he's guaranteeing Buredip.
That is correct.
Very quickly, what do you think the government should do about two sections in particular? First, MSMEs. They represent, I'll say this for the audience, 30% of GDP, 45% of manufacturing, 50% of exports, and they employ possibly 12 crore people. What the government has given them is a 3.7 lakh crore package of collateral-free loans and credit. Many people feel this is simply not enough. They are not going to bounce back to life. In the first instance, the government needs to clear what it owes them, which, if you add PSUs and state governments, I'm told amounts to something like 5 lakh crores. Should that be something the government does now, even if it can't afford it?
In any case, I think the MSMEs are in deep trouble. A couple of things have happened. See, to their credit, the Reserve Bank of India acted very quickly. And what they did was they gave a 3-month moratorium to the outstanding, the standard loan accounts. Unfortunately, they didn't make it mandatory. It was left at the discretion of the banks. And I had expected that about 70% of the loans outstanding would be given moratorium. But now I hear that, State Bank of India, India's largest bank, has only given 23% of loans moratorium. Now, what that means is that over a 3-month period where they are not producing, they're having to pay interest on their loans already accrued, which means that they are now defaulters. And as soon as the moratorium is lifted, they are all going to be lined up and taken to bankruptcy court.
Which is why you say MSMEs are in deep trouble. These are the first lot of bankruptcies that will hit us when the moratorium is lifted.
That's right.
One question about MSMEs: to what extent is their problem made worse by the fact that migrant labor that often worked for them have all gone home and are unlikely to return in a hurry?
Well, up to a point that is true, but that is not something which is across the board. A fairly large chunk of the workforce continues to be in situ. They are urban workers, so they will still be there. So the MSMEs may be able to work, perhaps not at full capacity, but at least 50-60% of their capacity if the demand exists.
And that is the big question. Does the demand exist? And with the government doing nothing to stimulate demand, it's unlikely to exist. Well, let's come to big industry. And I'm talking in particular about those sections of it that virtually ground to a halt with the lockdown: hotels, restaurants, aviation, car manufacturers, construction. There wasn't very much in the May package beyond a 70,000 crore boost to an existing middle income housing scheme to be built on a PPP basis. But beyond that, there wasn't much for this section of industry at all. What sort of plight are they in? What help do they need?
Well, that is difficult to say. Let's face facts. The tourism-related industry, I don't think there's much the government can do about it. There is no conceivable demand stimulus that I can think of offhand, which would help the tourism industry. Okay, and this would include airlines and hotels. And the reason for that is very simple. Tourism industry requires people to go out there and use those facilities. Now, if people are not going because of fear of infection, then that's not going to happen. And it doesn't matter how much money the government pumps in. So the help that one can give these people would essentially be by way of enabling them to pay back their loans to a point, to pay their workers, to keep them on. So that's about the best that can happen, and that can be blended in to the welfare measures rather than a demand stimulating measure.
So the government's response to this section, big industry, is not such a problem for the reasons you've explained, and the general blending in of demand will help them retain their staff, even if it won't bring back customers to them.
That's right.
There is one sector of the economy which the government does believe has taken the lockdown extremely well, and that's agriculture. The health minister is predicting that agriculture this year could grow at 3%. We believe the entire Rabi harvest has happened very successfully. The government proudly talks about how Madhya Pradesh procurement is the highest it's ever been. It might even overtake Punjab, they're saying. Do you think agriculture can, to some extent, salvage the Indian economy? Or is that already built into your
It's
prediction?
baked in. It's baked in.
It's built in.
Baked in. But there's bad news in that baking in as well. See, when we talk about a 3% growth in agriculture, we are talking about production. We are not necessarily talking about the income of farmers. The income of farmers depends upon how much they get in terms of prices. And if there is a major hit to incomes, particularly among the poorer segments, you may find demand for agricultural products falling and thereby to softening of agricultural prices, so that the actual gain to the farmer will not be 3%. It will be lower than that, perhaps by quite a bit, depending on how far the prices fall.
So we could end up with an anomalous situation where agricultural production is almost at record levels, even if that's at the moment a little difficult to believe. But at the same time, farmers' incomes could be sinking very poorly and farmers feeling poor, very poor, in fact.
That's
Are you saying yes? Are you
yes,
saying yes, sir?
yes, that's what I said. That
And
is
that means if farmers' incomes sink and farmers feel poor, they won't spend, and so rural demand will also go down,
this is correct.
which will add to the problem of demand sinking nationally, won't it?
That's right.
Because often rural demand keeps.
They are linked. It, the farmer's income will, if national incomes shrink, uh, then farmers' incomes will also shrink. They are not immune to that shrinkage.
In which case, it's quite clear that the government needs to spend much more. We need a fiscal stimulus that is a genuine one. So, for those who are listening and are willing to heed your advice, what sort of order of spending should the government undertake? What percentage of GDP, for instance, is necessary at this point as a fiscal stimulus?
Well, let me not talk about percentage of GDP, because frankly, without knowing what the GDP is going to be this year, there's no point in talking about percentages. It's better that we talk about rupees in lakh crores. Now, ideally, what we would like to come out of this is roughly 14 lakh crores worth of fiscal stimulus, 14 to 15 lakh crores. That's about a 7 to 8% of GDP last year. That would be ideal. But my sense is that even if the government has the intent to spend that amount, they will be physically and institutionally incapable of doing so. It's not going to happen. And so let's be realistic. And my realistic assessment is that the government could spend about additional, that is inclusive of what the 2 lakh crores they've already given, they can spend up to about 10 lakh crores over and above what has been budgeted. Of this, about half would be direct income transfers to the poor, and about half should go into infrastructure, particularly quick turnaround infrastructure, such as housing, as you said, such as a much expanded NREGS work, um, such as rural roads, and so on. But quick turnaround, where you can get the money onto the ground fast.
And this is additional 10 lakh crore to what is budgeted,
Okay,
by
but
which you mean, the budget announced on the 1st of February this year,
that's right.
which means that we're talking of a fiscal deficit, if it's still a meaningful concept to talk about, that is probably way above 5 or 6%. I'm guessing, but it's way above 5, 6%.
Oh, yes. I mean, look, the fiscal deficit, even if I give this 10 lakhs, this year the economy will contract by 5%. Okay? So if you think about the fiscal deficit, I'm adding 10 lakh crores to the spending. So in terms of last year's GDP, that is about 5% more than what was budgeted. Budget was 3.5%. That takes it up to 8.5%. Right? From that, you also have to realize that taxes are going to be lower. And taxes are going to be lower by about 3 lakh crores. That's another 1.5%. We are looking at a fiscal deficit of somewhere around 9 to 10%.
Will that worry people like Moody's, Fitch, Standard and Poor, or should we not care about them at this point of time?
Look, I mean, I am not willing to believe that the Moody's and Fitches are stupid people. They would first look at what's happening to growth before they start looking at the fiscal deficit. Because you can keep your fiscal deficit exactly where it was in terms of the budget. And then if your GDP drops, your fiscal deficit is going to look a whole lot worse anyway.
Sure. So, in other words, this concern about the level of the fiscal deficit and the second associated concern, what will rating agencies think, is a mistaken one at this point of time. The important thing is to get demand up, get growth up, and if you can get growth really rising rather than just in an illusionary sense, as we discussed earlier, then the fiscal deficit will very quickly come back in order and your ratings agencies will understand and give you the leeway.
That's right.
All of this calls for a certain amount of wisdom and a certain amount of confidence. And I'm using both of those deliberately, wisdom and confidence on the part of the government. Do you believe it's there? Or do you think this government, A, lacks good advice, and B, lacks the confidence to act on it?
No, from the indications I'm getting, the government is in a wait and watch mode. That they're going to wait to see how the economy moves before taking the next set of decisions. And what I'm suggesting, that is just the wrong way to go. Because you may get numbers which will give you a false sense of confidence.
Right. And unfortunately, the longer you wait, the worse the problem becomes,
That's
and
right.
the more desperate the situation will be. That is a terribly sobering assessment of the Indian economy. I'll take a break at that point. When I come back, I want to, much more briefly, ask you your opinion of the structural reforms the government has announced, and also ask you in the end what you make of the concept of Atmanirbhar Bharat. But first, a little break. Welcome back to a special interview for The Wire. My guest is India's former Chief Statistician and one of the country's most highly regarded economists, Pronab Sen. In part one, he gave us a particularly sobering, some would say sombering assessment of where the economy is at and what its prospects look like. I turn now to talk to him about the structural reforms the government has announced. Let's start, Dr. Sen, with the reforms to do with agriculture. There are three in particular: amending the Essential Commodities Act, agricultural marketing, and facilitating contract farming. Sanjeev Sanyal says that in fact this is the agricultural equivalent of the end of the license permit Raj. Would you agree, or is that an exaggeration?
Karan, let me put it very bluntly. Yes, If they do it, it would be the equivalent of that. But then let me also interject a little bit of history. All of these three things have been tried out by various governments over the last 25 years. None of them have managed to do it. And if this government can succeed, more power to them. But the politics of all of these three are really quite strong. And it would require a lot of pushing to get through.
Okay.
So take contract farming, for instance. Contract farming was pushed with a lot of fanfare. If you recall, Pepsi had this huge project in Punjab, various other companies in Bengal, in the south. All of them failed because essentially the government was unwilling to clamp down when the farmers broke their end of the contract. They're perfectly willing to crack down on the companies, but they were not willing to crack down on the farmers. Now, when you're talking about contract farming, both sides to the contract have to comply. Otherwise, it doesn't work.
So, as far as the agricultural reforms go, you're not really confident they'll see the light of day. They are more rhetorical rather than actual realized commitments.
Yeah, so I'd actually like all three of them are great ideas. As I said, they're not new ideas. They've been around for donkey's years. And successive governments have failed to push them through. So if
A,
this government can do it, all power to them.
a second reform that often is considered significant is the decision to allow the private sector to participate in all sectors of the economy whilst restricting the public sector to a still to be defined set of strategic areas. And this also includes a fair amount of privatization. How do you view this? And once again, are you worried that this may be rhetoric and not realizable?
There is, I think, a lot of utility in restricting the domain of the public sector. Um, but the point is that the public sector exists now across a wide range of activities. And the only way you're going to be able to do it is through privatization. Right? Now, privatization was a commitment of this government when it came in 2014. And now 5 years have passed and they have precious little to show for it. What they've done is disinvestment, which is mostly one PSU buying another PSU. But in terms of proper privatization, we have yet to see anything worth the substance.
And therefore, going by that track record, you're not at all confident the sort of privatization needed to get the public sector out of areas where this government thinks it shouldn't be, that sort of privatization won't happen. And if it doesn't happen, this reform will remain rhetoric.
Well, let's at least, we have two trial cases on hand, right? One was Air India, which has been in the making now for a while and hasn't happened. And the other is BPCL, which was announced last year and is still in the making. Now, these two, if they go through, that would be a signal achievement. But let me also make a point, and this is something that I think people don't realize, which is given the situation we are in today, where the economy is slowing down and slowing down rapidly, we're going into negative territory. Privatization at this stage is just the wrong thing to do. And the reason for that is that when you privatize, what you're doing is you're taking investment funds away from new greenfield projects to buying existing assets. Existing assets don't create jobs. It's new investments which do. So in a situation where the economy is already going down, privatization is a bad idea. It should be thought about only when the economy is back on the recovery path.
Let me come to a third set of reforms, this time not spoken of by the central government, but by three BJP-ruled state governments, UP, Madhya Pradesh and Gujarat. They've come up with a fairly radical sweeping relaxation of labor laws, but only for 1,000 days or 3 years. And then, to be honest, UP and Madhya Pradesh have slightly reversed what they promised they would do. My question is a simple one. Is labor law reform necessary at this point to revive the economy? And if it is this the right way of doing it? By ordinance and almost by diktat, without consultation?
Well, this is the wrong time to do labor reform. So let's get that particular argument out of the way. But let's also think about what it means. The ostensible reason for the relaxation of labor laws by these three states was that it would help attract new investment. But again, if you think about new investment, the average gestation time for a new project is more than 3 years. So if somebody decided to invest in one of these states because the labor laws had been relaxed, by the time his project comes on stream, the labor laws will have gone back to status quo ante. And he would probably in a bigger suit. Right? So that was a bad idea. Now, whether labor laws need to be changed, I think there is general agreement that they should.
But you have to do it.
But you have to do it at the right time and in the right way.
And on a permanent basis, not for 1,000 days.
Not going back and forth.
I'm coming to the end of this interview. Let me ask you about the concept of Atmanirbhar Bharat. The Prime Minister and the Finance Minister have, on the one hand, tried to reassure people this doesn't mean isolating India from the world. But in his Man Ki Baat speech just about 12 days ago, and in his address to CII, the Prime Minister spoke a lot about reducing imports. And the Home Minister has gone on record to ask the Indian people to only buy things made in India. So are you worried that hidden behind Atmanirbhar is actually protectionism and import substitution?
Yes, unfortunately, that's what it's starting to sound like. The Prime Minister was very clear when he made the statement about what his intentions were. But the subsequent developments really do not fill you with confidence. You're absolutely right on that. That it does sound extremely protectionist.
And this sort of protectionism would be very adverse, I presume, to India's ambitions to boost exports.
Well, it's worse than that. We are already looking at an impaired world economy. And if India starts moving in this direction, I think you should expect to see retaliatory action from across the world, countries around the world. And that's going to make things even worse.
My last question, Dr. Sen. The government is also hoping that it can attract investment that is relocating from China. Leave aside the question that there may not be that much investment wanting to leave China because people are questioning how much of that is going to happen. But the government hopes that it can lure investment that is leaving China because of the very good new corporate tax rates that were announced, which are as low as 15% for new companies. The problem is there are still a lot of adverse factors in India. People coming to India would have land availability problems, there are labor law problems, there is red tape, there is extortion at times, there is retrospective amendment of laws as Vodafone saw, there are delays at courts for infrastructure, and there's always the threat of tax terrorism. So even though the corporate tax rate has gone down to 15%, do you believe India looks inviting to foreign investment?
Frankly, this is something we've been talking about for a while, this relocation from China. So far, we have been spectacularly unsuccessful in attracting anybody. Other countries, Vietnam, Thailand, Malaysia, Bangladesh, they've all done better. And I see nothing that has changed since then. So yes, you're going to see companies not necessarily relocating out of China, but you will see a lot of companies who will be trying to diversify their sources, and they will be looking at alternative production areas. But most of this would probably be new investment rather than investments being wound up in China and brought over here. Now, I don't see globally new investments going any place over the next couple of years.
Because of the state of the global economy as a result of what we've been through. So once again, the dream the government has that large sums of foreign investment will come galloping to India is really going to remain just a dream.
Yes. In fact, what the government should be working on is large sums of Indian investments staying in India, I think would be a lot more productive.
You think there's real danger that large sums of Indian investment may choose to go abroad instead?
They could. Much depends on how our economy looks.
In other words, we're ending this interview with one thought that is dominant. A lot depends on the government taking the right decision, boosting demand, not waiting and watching to see what happens because that simply postpones the problem, acting decisively, swiftly, and now.
That's right.
Are you confident that would happen, or are you seriously worried it won't?
No, I'm seriously worried it won't. That the wait and watch will continue. You will be seeing unreliable good news coming, and then the bottom will fall out.
Oh dear. Those are somber words to end on. And then the bottom will fall out. Let me try and end on a note of humor. Let's hope when the bottom falls out, there's a Dunlop pillow cushion to land on.
Well, or we land bottoms up.
Yes, bottoms up we may need in a big way after this interview. We may need to actually drown ourselves. Professor Sen, thank you very much, not just for an honest interview, but for one that truly make people sit up, and one which I hope the government listens to repeatedly and acts upon as well. Take care, stay safe.
You too, Karan. Thank you.
To receive instant updates on all videos from The Wire, click the subscribe button and hit the bell icon. Pay to support independent journalism. Click the link in the description and choose the amount you want to pay.